Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thanks to all of you for spending 30 minutes of your time with me. I'm very, very excited to be on this stage here today for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's given me a chance to visit beautiful Vilnius. It's my first time. I've only been here about 20 hours, and I absolutely love it. It's also very exciting to be here because I get to meet so many people and hear your stories and your insights from the world of work, which, as a professor, a lot of my work is very theoretical. It's nice to talk to real people solving real problems. And perhaps the biggest reason why I'm very excited to be on this stage is because of this yellow light. Because I was speaking, this was about a year ago, at a conference very much like this, and there was no light. And I was really into my story and moving around. I don't know if the people listening were into the story. I was. And then I just walked right off the stage and fell flat on the floor. And was very embarrassed and got up, and I didn't hurt myself. And I think Anthony mentioned this morning that sometimes people just remember the speaker and not what they said. I think that day, people just remembered me and what I did. So my goal is that today you actually remember some of the things I say as well. And thanks to this light, I'll try to stay on the stage. So I'm going to talk about why we celebrate the wrong leaders, which is a topic I'm very passionate about and have spent a lot of time looking into. But before we do that, let's do a little thought experiment together. Let's pretend we're not here at this conference, but we are about to set off together, all of us, on a polar expedition. And we need to hire a captain who's going to lead us. And we have two resumes in front of us. Okay? One comes from a man who has already successfully achieved all four of the major polar goals: the North Pole and the South Pole, and the Northeast and the Northwest Passage. In fact, 3 of these he was the first to accomplish. Let's call him Candidate A. Candidate B is a man who set off for the Antarctic 4 times, and every time resulted in failure, catastrophe, or death. Who should we hire? It's not meant to be a trick question, right? We want to hire candidate A, right? He's clearly the man for the job. But in reality, we often trick ourselves into hiring somebody like candidate B, even though he's clearly not up for the job. How do I know? Well, because both of these men were actually real polar explorers during the so-called golden age of polar exploration. And in the centuries since, one of them has been consistently celebrated as a leadership role model in best-selling books, in 19 Harvard Business School case studies, in consulting pamphlets, and in an endless stream of social media posts. But, surprisingly, shockingly, this is not candidate A, but the very much disaster-prone Anglo-Irish explorer, Ernest Shackleton. Meanwhile, candidate A, the Norwegian Roald Amundsen, has been largely forgotten in leadership studies, even though he's by any metric the most successful polar explorer to have ever lived. As I was preparing these slides, I did a quick search in my university's library catalog. And keep in mind, I teach at a very small, regional Swiss business school. We have no fewer than 176 books and articles in our library that celebrate Shackleton's leadership greatness. For Amundsen, we have 32. And half of those either I wrote or I ordered for our library. And as I was preparing these slides, I took a quick look in my LinkedIn feed. I found nothing on Amundsen, but I found this: top 5 leadership traits of explorer Ernest Shackleton. Or this: leadership is not just about getting people to follow you in calm waters, but holding them together when the ship is sinking, Shackleton. Or this, another Shackleton post. There's something deeply emotional about our love, our fascination with Shackleton and people like him. And here's how I know that that's true. I've written articles in major international newspapers where I've called Donald Trump a danger to democracy, even a fascist. But the only article I've ever written that's resulted in actual hate mail, people writing me, wishing me pain, telling me I'm an idiot, was this article I wrote in the Chicago Tribune questioning Shackleton's leadership qualities. So, what's going on here, right? Why are we obsessed with a clearly flawed role model and overlooking a truly gifted one? And of course, this is not just true in the realm of historical polar explorers. We see the same in all kinds of areas, including business. So my question is, why do we celebrate the wrong leaders? And I think it has something to do with what I call the action fallacy. Our mistaken belief that the best leaders are those who generate the most noise and sensational activity in the most dramatic circumstances. Right? In other words, we confuse a good story for good leadership. Right? But the two are not the same. Right? In fact, very often, good leadership will result in a bad story. Okay? Let me explain what I mean. Let's imagine for one moment leadership not being about leading a polar exploration, right? Or about turning a company around in dire circumstances. But let's imagine leadership simply as the act of swimming across a river. And not just any river, but like a violent river with rocks lurking below the surface and currents flowing everywhere. If a swimmer ventures in haphazardly and nearly drowns, but as he's halfway across, fights around, screams, uses all his strength, and somehow manages to drag himself back to safety, we're going to notice him. And we're going to say, wow, what a guy. He really fought hard to get himself out of that crisis. But if we have a swimmer who has spent a lifetime humbly understanding the river and ventures in at just the right time, in just the right spot, and moves her body in subtle ways so the current does most of the work, we're probably not going to notice her. And if we do, we would probably say, that looks pretty easy. Right? Amundsen and Shackleton are a case in point. Right? Shackleton, the much celebrated but flawed candidate B, is best known for his ill-fated endurance expedition, which set off in the summer of 1914 and saw his ship become trapped and eventually crushed by the ice off Antarctica. And he and his men were then forced to undertake a dangerous trek across the ice and to brave some of the stormiest seas on Earth before reaching the safety of South Georgia in 1916. Now, Shackleton was a tenacious man, no doubt, and his is a captivating story, fit for Hollywood, right? But it's not a good story to draw leadership lessons from. Because admirable those efforts were in getting his crew back to safety, the crisis that beset his ship was entirely of his own making. Right? He overlooked the advice of local whalers that the ice was particularly dangerous that year, and he overlooked massive deficits in his crew selection, in his training, and in his equipment. And it gets worse. Rarely mentioned in the LinkedIn posts and the best-selling books is the fact that Shackleton's other ship, the Aurora, suffered an even bigger crisis, the result of which was 3 lost lives. In contrast, Roald Amundsen's journeys make for boring reading, right? Not because he was lucky, but because through his careful planning and through his iterative and authentic leadership while underway, he avoided drama and these crises that beset the British explorers. Right? In 1905, he achieved in a tiny fishing vessel what the mighty British Navy had failed to do the previous 8 decades, to find and navigate the Northwest Passage above the mainland of Canada. In 1911, he reached the South Pole, a journey of 3,000 kilometers across uncharted terrain, and arrived back at his camp after 99 days, just 1 day off his planned schedule. If Shackleton is the swimmer who ventures recklessly into the water and nearly drowns, Amundsen's the swimmer who has humbly studied the river and uses its currents to get him safely across, and so makes it look easy. Now, the action fallacy causes real problems, and not just for our interpretation of polar explorers. Right? It's a feature of our offices today as well, because the same biases and misconceptions we use to viewing the past are one and the same with which we view the present. It is the Shackletons of our offices, rather than the Amundsens, who are being promoted, who serve as role models, right, and get the big rewards. This is something that studies in organizational psychology have confirmed in recent years. We see leadership potential in people who speak more, regardless of what they say. In people who appear confident, regardless of their competence. And in people who are perpetually busy, regardless of what they're actually doing. In other words, appearing to be an effective leader, rather than actually being one behind the scenes, is the key to promotion and bonus and fame today. Okay? And this obviously causes problems. Right? It puts the wrong people in charge of companies, which then don't perform at their full potential. It creates a toxic climate in which those actually doing impactful work feel overlooked and undervalued. But worst of all, I think, is that it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. Right? If these are our role models, then we're actively creating more of them. As my colleague, Professor Keith Grint, has written, since we reward people who are good in crises and ignore people who are such good managers that there are very few crises, people soon learn to seek out or reframe situations as crises. And this is obviously not good for our organizations. So, what are we to do? Well, first, I think we have to train ourselves to ignore these captains of crises, the Shackletons of the office, who are stumbling from one crisis to another, or who have learned to speak of everything as a crisis. Right? But I also think we have to rethink what good leadership looks like. Right? We have to learn to spot more subtleties in leadership potential. And of course, the question is, what is it that makes somebody like Amundsen, or the Amundsens of our offices, what is it that makes them so good, yet somewhat invisible? And of course, leadership is complicated. You need a big toolkit. And there's a lot of things that you need to do well to be a good leader. You need to have communication skills. You need to be a strong analytical and strategic thinker. You need to have organizational abilities. You need to have strong emotional intelligence. However, there's one trait that if we look at Roald Amundsen's life and career carefully, really stands out. And interestingly, it's the same trait that's being increasingly identified in leadership studies today as being consistently overlooked, but also incredibly powerful for leaders to have. And before I tell you what that is, let me tell you about a study that my colleague David Deming of Harvard University conducted just last year. He split people up into different teams, and the teams had a challenge to take care of, right? And in some teams, he asked, who wants to be the leader? And whoever wanted to lead the most got to be the leader of that team. In other teams, he just randomly picked somebody and said, you're going to lead this team. Guess which teams performed better? The ones where the leader was randomly picked, consistently and substantially. Or, the insight, as David Deming reframes it, people with the greatest preference for being in charge are, on average, worse than randomly assigned managers. Why? That's the big question, right? Why? Well, because, he found out, the people who really, really, really want to lead often, not always, but often lack in this critical trait, humility. Right? Humility has been identified in the last few years as an absolute leadership superpower. Right? Humility, in a series of studies, has shown to boost productivity, innovation, and problem solving. It increases satisfaction and trust among the people who work with this leader, and it creates so-called team potency, right? The team gets a real scrappiness. They want to work hard because collective humility takes hold. They all behave this way. Okay? So what exactly is humility in the context of leadership? Well, there's kind of three key traits that researchers have identified. The first one is an appreciation of others' strengths and contributions. Right? This is not meant in a token way, but it's fundamentally seeing and valuing everybody on a team or in an organization for who they are. I think back to Theo's talk about neurodiversity. We need to value everybody's unique contributions. The next one, teachability or being open to new ideas and feedback. Again, this sounds simple, but it's not. It means as a leader walking through the world thinking, I do not have all the answers. And many of the assumptions I hold, or many of the things I believe are true, might actually be false. And the final one is the willingness to acknowledge one's limits and failures. Right? Think back to when Anthony was speaking this morning, and he mentioned this failure he had of speaking at a conference in the US, and then people thinking it was awesome, but not really remembering anything he said. When he shared this story of failure with us, did you think, oh, what a loser? Of course not. If you speak about your limits and failures, it projects confidence, and it projects an image of somebody who is aware of themselves and others as well. If we look at how Roald Amundsen led his expeditions, and I don't want to get into all the details here, we recognize all of these things, right? He was very open to learning. In an age where most Europeans had nothing to learn from indigenous populations, he adopted Inuit clothing, methods of preserving food, and methods of transportation. Right? He also tried to study the Arctic environment humbly and recognizing the fact that there's a limit to how he as one individual can move in this environment. The British, they tried to overcome it with more dynamite, larger steam engines, more discipline, etc. It didn't work out so well. Right? But most importantly, he realized that if I'm spending 5 years together with my men cramped in a small cabin, I need to see them as humans. I need to treat them as humans. Right? And he wrote often about how much discipline actually was something he didn't like and didn't think was effective. He wrote, for example, "I know myself how irksome this strict discipline is," referring to the British. Right? But more importantly than what he said, here's what one of his crew members had to say. Oh, there's Amundsen. Here's what his crew member had to say. "The discipline was instinctive. In the daily life, there were not distinctions of rank, and yet no one was ever in doubt about who was in command." Right? The men followed him not because of pressure or because of fear, but because of trust and respect. But let's leave Amundsen and the polar explorers aside for a moment. I mean, there's many leaders who exemplify a humility. Right? If we look just in the Baltic region, two that come to my mind are Kaja Kallas and Ingvar Kamprad, the famous founder of IKEA, who famously drove a beaten-up Volvo until the end of his career, even though he could have bought any car he wished. But I'd like to look at just this final point with the example of two other leaders, kind of communicate how powerful this is in a leadership context. The first one is Jacinda Ardern, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand. And you might remember that during the COVID-19 pandemic, she had some of the highest trust ratings among any politician, even after COVID-19 reached the shores of New Zealand. Right? Trust, both in the sense that people believed the information she was giving them and believed that she was making good decisions. And Ardern became known for making speeches and sentences like this one. "We will never pretend we have all the answers, and there is no guarantee that our approach will work." You can tell from my accent I'm half American. I don't recall my president ever making any such statements. Another example, these pictures are of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander during the Second World War, the day before the D-Day invasion. Right? And here he's talking to paratroopers as they're boarding their planes to be dropped over occupied France. Right? And he projected confidence, he told them he believed in them, etc. But that night, when he went back to his cabin, he lived in a small cabin next to the airfield, Eisenhower wrote this note. And here's what it says. "Our landings in the Cherbourg Harbor area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. This particular operation," and then you can see he crosses that out, and instead of this particular operation, he writes, "My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." And this he underlines. Okay? This is leadership. Right? To him, it was clear success would be a collective effort, but failure would be his alone to own. Right? And if it had failed, there would have been any number of circumstances or people he could have blamed, but that never occurred to him. Right? He wrote this note, folded it up, put it in his wallet in case he needed it the next day. Of course, he didn't. So to me, humility is all about awareness, right? An awareness of yourself, an awareness of the people around you, and an awareness of the circumstances within which you find yourself, which are sometimes more powerful than you are. And I think this type of leadership is more important now than ever. And here's why. Because the problems we're dealing with today in companies and in society are increasingly complex, increasingly interlinked, and increasingly time-sensitive. Right? What in the past could be solved by one person now requires a true collaborative effort. Let me just give you two examples that highlight this point. When the Concorde was built in the 60s, it required the collaboration of 250 engineers. 40 years later, when the Airbus A380 was built, it required 6,000 engineers who had to coordinate and collaborate. The average lifespan of companies in the 1960s was 61 years. Today, it's 20 years. It's estimated that by the end of the decade, it will be 15 years. The world is increasingly complex and moving increasingly fast. And that's why we need leaders who can assess this properly and lead with humility. But the problem is, right as this need for collaboration is growing, studies tell us employee engagement across the globe is declining. A study from last summer that looked at 184,000 companies around the world found that 77% of employees did not feel engaged at work. Right? Did not feel connected to their leaders, or to their organizations, and the organization's purpose. Okay? So this is a crisis, and it's a crisis that I would say challenges us to rethink what a good leader looks like. And so I encourage all of you, but also myself, I'm not immune from this either, to start seeing leadership potential, not by how much somebody speaks, but by the quality of what they say and do. Not by how much somebody talks about themselves, but by how others talk about them. Not by how many fires someone puts out, but by how few fires they encounter. And not by how many successes someone claims, but by how many failures they own up to. And I think this is important, right? Because the next time your organization is faced with, the equivalent of an iceberg looming on the horizon, who do you want in charge? The guy who responds to his ship freezing in place by cranking the engine, shouting at his men, and unpacking the dynamite? Or the guy who avoids getting stuck in the first place? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Martin.